Hi, everyone. This is AJ Woodhams, the host of the War Books podcast, where I interview today's best authors writing about war related topics. Today, I am so excited to have Alexander Rose on the show for his new book, The Lion and the Fox: Two Rival Spies and the Secret Plot to Build a Confederate Navy. Alexander Rose is the author of the New York Times best-selling book Washington Spies, which was the basis for the AMC television series Turn. He has written several nonfiction books, and his writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other publications. He earned his doctorate from Cambridge University and is a member of the U.S. Commission on Military History, the Society for Military History, and the Royal Historical Society. Alex, how are you today?
I'm not bad. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pack
It's
of lies.
Yeah, I mean, very impressive introduction too. I got to say, so I don't think I've ever made this comment about a book on the show. I loved your book, by the way,
Oh, thank you.
but the artwork on the cover of this book is incredible. For those who are listening and not watching, so it's the lion and the fox in big block Civil War era font. You've got two sets of eyes that are like just like slits. You've got a sinking ship, uh, painting of a burning ship that's sinking in the background. Which I think I know what ship that is, but I don't know if it's a spoiler if I say that
I'm
here, or
sure it's
maybe I'm
fine.
wrong. But it's really impressive artwork, I got to say. So I was very impressed with that.
Well, thank you. I'd like to steal all the credit, but I can't. That was actually the designer who came up with the actual design. I was just there to be Mr. Interference by saying, no, 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 I want the spy's eyes 3 millimeters to the left. So we
Oh,
went
very
back
nice.
and forth a lot like that. But no, I did not come up with
Okay.
that great idea. I'm afraid.
Well, it's people do definitely judge a book by its cover. So good judgment from me on this. So your book, really interesting topic I really didn't know much about. The Civil War is very interesting to me, but I really only know like the high points. So Confederate spies in Liverpool in England, nonetheless, just a whole new topic for me. So I was so fascinated. Now you've written about the Revolutionary War previously. Is this your first Civil War book?
Yeah, well, yes, I'm pretty sure it is. I think I've had chapters in other books. I think for my Men of War book, I did a long analysis of the combat or the experience of combat at Gettysburg, and I think in my book before this, Empires of the Skies, about zeppelins and airplane, the early histories of airplanes. I think I kick it off with Count von Zeppelin, the creator of the great airships, who was a German officer who came over during the war, met Abraham Lincoln, as you did. He just sort of waltzed into the White House, said hi, and then went on a little tour of all the little battlefields. And that's where he was out in, I think, Minnesota or somewhere, and uh, he uh, he sort of went up for the first time in a balloon, and that's what sort of set him
Okay.
going with I'm
All
going
right.
to invent an airship one day. So I have done Civil War stuff
Sure.
before, but I'm not a Civil War historian by
Sure, sure,
any
sure.
means.
So then you have a book. It's like one and a half books maybe of Civil War writing.
Yeah, I've done a
Go
bit.
ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a journeyman,
Very cool. Very cool.
Civil War historian of sorts. But
Well, well, then for this time period, I guess what got you interested in it? What made you want to write about the Civil War?
well, there's a couple of things. First, I'd done the Revolutionary War espionage or intelligence system with Washington Spies, and I've always thought, oh, it'd be nice to have a kind of a sequel. And so, I've always been wanting to do a Civil War book. And by the way, there's what I'm writing now is the book I'd swore about a war I'd never write about, but I actually did, which is World War II. So I'm actually doing one about U-boats and intelligence
Okay.
now. So it's going to be like the third in the trilogy, the sort of the Return of the Jedi of uh,
Well, I
of,
will definitely ask you about that
of
later on.
intelligence, American intelligence history. But the fact is that the idea behind this book, I mean, I think I wrote it down Oh, it had to be just after when Washington Spies came out, which is about 2006, 2007. Now, when you're a writer, you spend a lot of your time coming up with ideas, and you write them down. You put them in a little file somewhere, and and then you come back to them a little while later, a couple of years later, and you think, oh, geez, this is the worst idea I've ever heard. I mean, was I drunk when I wrote this? Why did I ever think this was a good idea? And so that happens with 99% of them. But there was this one here, which was about the Civil War, and I knew from the beginning that I wanted to do it. I'd heard a story about a Union spy and a Confederate spy in Liverpool during the Civil War, and I knew what I wanted to do was kind of base it on the old Mad Magazine strip of spy versus spy. You have the black spy and the white spy, and they're kind of locked in this eternal struggle for mastery. So I knew what the shape of the book would be. I just didn't know how to do it. So what happened was, I mean, I was thinking about, like, because it's such a complicated Byzantine story, and there are scores, 200 ships involved, and events overlap, and it's just and there's tens of thousands of pieces, documents about this, here and there. So I didn't really know how to break the story. I couldn't figure it out. So I went on to other things, but every so often I would come back and I would think, oh, this book, it'd be so cool. And I had the title, which was The Secret Agents, which was going to be, based on the sort of Joseph Conrad, The Secret Agent book. It was called The Secret Agents. It was so cool. And then whenever I told my agent, yeah, I'm thinking of doing The Secret Agents, he would just go, that's a terrible title. I'm not even going to write that into a contract.
I think
His
it's a
was
good title, it's
his was A
straightforward.
Spy in Grey, which I think was actually much, much worse. So that I vetoed that. But 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 I would keep on coming back, and eventually, just a couple of years, and so I went into other books, like about zeppelins and battles and all this kind of stuff. And I eventually came back to a couple of years ago, just before, I think it was just before COVID, and I figured out, it came to me in a kind of a like one of sort of Joseph's dreams, like, oh, I know how to structure the book. And it was going to be a three-stage process, and it was very usefully alliterative too, in the sense that it was going to be about, part one was going to be the raiders. The runners, the blockade runners. And then the part two was going to be the raiders, commerce raiders. Part three was going to be the lead rams. So it was all the three R's essentially. And then everything would slot into that. The whole story would slot into those three phases, you see, with a bit of jiggery pokery here and there. And so once I had that, then it was all go, and then it just went really fast. I mean, it was the fastest book I wrote. I mean, there was a lot of reading to do, a lot of things to put together, but because of that very
Yeah,
strong
you
structure.
had, like, I think I read in the acknowledgments, there were some however thousands of mini intelligence reports that you had to go through at the was it the British Archive? Tons of
No, no,
documents.
no, no. Everything was in the National Archives outside of Washington. I think what you're referring to is the reports of the Liverpool consuls, the consul to
Okay.
Liverpool, to the State Department, and there are, I mean, hundreds of, scores of volumes of stuff that, from various American consuls around the world. I mean, there was nothing special about Liverpool in that sense. And these guys would every week compile a report of a couple of pages, and sort of dutifully send it into the State Department in Washington, where it would, some low level civil servant would read it and go, great, and then just sort of file it away. uh, but so there was these hundreds and hundreds of reports that Thomas Dudley, that's the Union a spy who was serving as American consul in Liverpool, had submitted, and people hadn't read these things since they'd been submitted essentially, and they were all on the worst medium available. I mean, the medium whose name you hear when you're a historian and you shudder with dread, and that is microfilm.
Nice.
Like,
I've looked at some microfilm.
you get used to it, but the whole fixing it up in the machines, and the wheels,
Yeah.
you know, squeaking back, it's just horrible. But that everything was on there. So just before COVID hit, I was lucky enough, and then I just requested or ordered them to be digitized, the relevant volumes of these. And so they sent it to me. It took a couple of months, and they got back to me. And it was thousands of pages throughout the war of Dudley's reports. And this stuff was intelligence gold. I mean, he had everything in there in this rather thankfully very easy to read 19th century hand. And it would
That
just
was a
explain
question I had because I've
the whole
seen Civil
story.
War documents that are just like this writing that is you spend 30 minutes trying to decipher what it looks like anyway.
There are the odd word, but nowadays when it's digitized, you can. I did this with Washington Spies as well. I don't think I could have done it when it was simply on paper. You can just magnify it to 200 times, and you can usually try and make out what they're saying. Though with Washington Spies, with the 18th century, you're dealing with quills, and so you have to hope that the guy was lavish enough to spend a little bit on a high quality quill and some good ink. Otherwise, it's very hard to read with a very. It's like trying to make out a Sharpie or something, a thick Sharpie. But in this case, it was quite easy. I mean, it took a long time to just go through them, and many of them were very tedious. But if you put it all together, I mean, you had the story of Dudley's espionage career in Liverpool throughout the course of the war. So it was a great asset.
Yeah, well, let's dive right into kind of the backdrop of this story then. So your book starts in 1861 in Liverpool, where we meet our first character, you just mentioned, Thomas Dudley. So what was Thomas Dudley doing in Liverpool? What was his personality like? What was his job? Tell us about Dudley.
Dudley was the son of a New Jersey farmer, very modest, humble background. Father died early. He helped his mother, keep the farm running. Quaker, strict, you know, you know, sort of, highly regulated, very rigid sort of background. He put himself through a sort of a local college and apprenticeship to become a lawyer. And so, when by the time the war breaks out, he's got a sort of an established practice, and I think in Camden or Trenton or somewhere. It's just local, conveyancing and bare bones lawyer. But he was more interesting than that. He was, from a very early age, he was very powerfully abolitionist. And he wasn't just him mouthing words, because anyone can do that. He would actually head off down south and dressed in what he believed to be a kind of a slave trader outfit, which basically consisted of a big hat and a whip and a couple of guns. And he would go down south, and he would trace blacks who'd been sort of kidnapped across state lines from the free states, and were being brought into sort of Maryland and Virginia, and they would be sold on to go to the plantations in the deep South. And he would go and he would try and he would rescue them, or he'd sort of buy them out, buy them out of bondage. And so he did this several times. I mean, this is a risky thing to do. If you get caught doing this, you're probably for the high jump. And so he and then after that he kind of goes into Republican politics in the early 1850s, state level stuff, and he pulls a few strings at the Republican convention that nominated Lincoln, and he manages to persuade the New Jersey delegation to switch its votes from sort of their local favorite son to Lincoln. So he does some service, and as a reward for this, a couple of months after he becomes inaugurated, Lincoln calls him in and says, "Hey, so here's a bauble." Basically, that's how these things work. Would you like to be ambassador to Japan? It's nice. Or would you like to be consul to Liverpool, which is a much lower diplomatic posting than obviously an ambassadorship? Uh, Dudley was a bit of a homebody, didn't want to be away for too long. Being a consul meant you usually did about a year abroad, and it was something to put on your resume. And then he would come home and he'd get back to his practice. And there was another thing too, in that a few years earlier he'd survived a really horrific shipping accident where the ferry he was on had sunk in an icy river, and he'd actually been, I think, technically dead, but was revived at the last second. So he kind of had this idea that he'd been revived to carry out a kind of a divine mission, and that was to abolish slavery and save the United States. And so he chose consul to Liverpool simply because, for that reason, that he wanted to be close to good doctors, and he thought being in I think Kyoto was just way too far away from the U.S. So that's how he ends up there. Now he thinks he's just going to be there for about a year, and he's going to be a consul. And a consul is essentially some little appointee, and it's a kind of a sinecure essentially of your job is just to bail out drunken sailors out of prison, and to, if some tourist gets pickpocketed, you make sure they have enough money and that they have
Yeah.
they get their passport stamped to get back home.
Well,
It's that kind of
speaking of drunken sailors and pickpockets, I really loved how you opened this book with a description of Liverpool in the 1860s. Could you tell us a little bit about Liverpool, what it was like, and what Dudley was walking into when he took this job as consul?
Well, yeah. Well, we tend to think, as as moderns, we tend to think of Liverpool as, well, as the home of John and Paul and Ringo and George, or Liverpool, FC. It wasn't like that at all. Yeah, Liverpool was a very different city. At that time, it was possibly the greatest port metropolis in the world. It was, it built more ships there than anywhere else in the world combined. It had the sort of the world's first cotton or futures exchange was being developed there, for speculation. It was immensely wealthy, and it was a huge cotton importer. I mean, nearly all of the cotton imported from the South, which was in British terms a colossal amount. I mean, it was what I think one of the biggest imports of in Britain went through Liverpool, and was handled there through the exchanges, and then it went out to the big factories in Manchester and Lancashire and other places where it would be converted into textiles and wonderful clothing, and then re-exported to the rest of the world at a huge markup.
Now,
So
Liverpool
it was a
though,
very different place. Sorry.
it did have a darker side to it, I guess, is what
Well, yes, but
I'm remembering.
so there
Massive
was
crime,
that Liverpool.
murder.
There was that
Yeah,
Liverpool. The kind of, as sort of Jerusalem and Rome had once been. It regarded itself as the navel of the world. But there was also a different side to Liverpool, as you just mentioned, and that was that it was also possibly the most crime-ridden, you know, vice-soaked city, not just in Britain, but in much of Europe. You could put it into that category. I mean, the crime rate was astounding. The murder rate was unbelievable. There were gang wars going on. It was all a bit, very, very Peaky Blinders, put it that way. Of the 1860s, it was. I mean, the 19th century equivalent of opioid abuse was essentially alcoholism.
yeah.
Rum,
The
gin, rum,
alcohol is what I
gin.
remember reading about. Like 3-year-old, you read about like a 3-year-old being at the table and drinking was not a that's not an uncommon situation in Liverpool at
Well,
this time
no,
period.
and again, you have to remember, at the time there were no licensing rules. Literally anyone could open a pub in his or her own house. I mean, there
Yeah.
were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of
Yeah.
drinking places in Liverpool. So everyone, and again, it was so cramped. The density of the population was much larger than, I think, Singapore or anything like that. It was really very, very cramped, especially in the slums. You would have houses built for 10 people that would have 90 in them. I mean, this was a real. People were living in basements. I think there were 24,000 children who lived on the street. Who were all kind of prey for various Fagans. So again, it was a very rough place, and then added to it, there were thousands and thousands of sailors from around the world there too. So it was a really quite an extraordinary place, Liverpool. That
Now,
Yeah.
yeah. So when Dudley arrives in Liverpool, which Liverpool is he seeing? Is he seeing kind of this very wealthy upper class Liverpool, or is it just is the slum nature of Liverpool so unavoidable that
Well,
he
he
knows.
disembarks at the docks, which were the some of the worst of all. So he gets to Liverpool and he's with his rather nice family, and I mean, he's immediately accosted by various con men, shiv artists, various black market dealers. I mean, it's a quite a rough welcome. He was probably thinking, I really should have gone to
Gone to Japan.
Japan. Get this kind of stuff in Japan. You don't even get the stuff in New York. Which was sort of gangs of New York style stuff. It was much better there uh, than in Liverpool. So, but he makes his and he doesn't, and he also doesn't hang around a lot of the posh rich people, that sort of the great cotton lords or the shipbuilding dynasts or anything like that. And the main reason is that he's a Union man, and Liverpool was a Confederate city. It had so many connections to the South and it was so connected through. In the 18th century, it'd been slavery, but in the 19th century, it had become cotton. That it was just extreme. I mean, he was kind of this Daniel in a den of lions type thing. So he has very very few friends there. He's kind of cut off. He's isolated, and the whole business elite of the city is really against him. I mean, he has a great story where, being a consul to Liverpool, an American consul to Liverpool, a bit like Nathaniel Hawthorne, the great writer, had been consul there 10 years earlier, and had a very enjoyable time of it because it was essentially, you just go to a lot of dinners and have toasts to yourself, and American British understanding and all this kind of stuff. It's a very easy job. For him, he gets visited. For Dudley, he's in his boarding house the first day or two he gets there, and he's visited by this sort of congregation from the what's known as the American Board of Commerce, who were merchants dealing with American affairs. They weren't Americans themselves. It was mostly cotton and shipbuilding and exports and stuff. And they just start lecturing him about how the war is going to be won by the Confederacy and he should just give up now. And he just basically better to keep his nose clean if he knows what's good for him. And Dudley, I think that this is the first indication that they don't understand who they're dealing with. And this would have worked on most other consuls, but on Dudley, he just decides, he writes down this, I made my mind up to be very forthright in my reply. And so he just sends this broadside back to them, stating that the United States will prosecute this war against slavery to the last dollar in the treasury and the last drop of blood. And don't underestimate us. We will crush these rebels.
Yeah,
Right?
he definitely was not there to make
And
friends.
grind their
I
faces
gotta
with our
say.
boots, kind of stuff.
Yeah,
And they went away shocked
yeah.
that they were dealing with a wholly new creature here. So Dudley is a very strong character. But again, as I said, he's a Daniel in a den of lions. He's a lot
Sure.
to struggle against there.
Well, then let's shift into the second main character of this book, James Bullock, who is a Confederate man. Tell us a little bit about James Bullock. What brings him to? We just touched on this a little bit, but what brings him to Liverpool? What kind of person was he? What was his personality?
Bullock is the mirror opposite of Dudley. That's one reason why the book eventually became called "The Lion and the Fox," after a quote from Petrarch. But Dudley is the lion, whereas Bullock is the fox. Bullock was from an old line Georgia family, quite affluent merchants and various gentry, slaveholders, going back 200 years or something. Bullock himself, James Bullock himself, spent very very little time in the South. He actually went to boarding school in Connecticut, I think, from when he was a young age, and then when he was in his mid teens, he joined the U.S. Navy. This is back in the 1840s or so. He didn't so he didn't grow up there. He never owned slaves himself, and as he said, he never owned any property down there. So he was based in New York, and after retiring from the U.S. Navy, he becomes a captain on I think a mail steamer that plies its trade between New York and Havana. And he's a very good captain. I mean, he really is. He's very very precise, but he's always quite scheming. He's very manipulative. He's very devious, and he's very discreet. So I mean, whereas Dudley was dogmatic, Bullock was feline. You could put it that way. And then he just gets swept up into the secret world by accident, almost, in that the Confederate government notices is looking for, when at the outbreak of war, the Confederate government's looking for a very special person to conduct a very special mission in Liverpool, and that is to build or commission a clandestine Confederate Navy. The Confederate Navy at that time, at the beginning of the war, consisted of precisely one ship, so it wasn't very impressive. The U.S. Navy wasn't a whole lot better, but they had about sort of 30 working ships. I mean, these were not powerful things, but it was a lot. That was a lot better than the Confederate one. The Confederate Navy had a lot of good officers who had volunteered or had left the U.S. Navy to come, but they didn't have anything to sail, any blue water ships, that is. So, what's his name? Bullock gets called in to see the sort of Secretary of the Navy, and he gets told about, look, we want you. We're going to send you to Liverpool, and we want you to just buy some blockade runners, some commerce raiders, and eventually some ironclads, which were very advanced warships at the time. You have to be discreet. You have to be trustworthy. You're going to be left on your own for a long time because we're not going to be in contact with you. We'll send you lots of money. Don't worry about it. Liverpool is on our side. This will be a doddle. So Bullock also goes to Liverpool thinking he'll only be there for about a year or so and that this will be easy. But he gets there, and as he's traveling over to Liverpool, his mission, which was once very simple, becomes all at once very, very complex. And that is for a couple of reasons. One of which is that the British declared unexpectedly neutrality. The Confederates had been assuming that the British would form a kind of an Anglo-Confederate alliance against the hated North, or the Union. The Union was very unpopular in Britain because they were free traders, and in the North they were regarded as tariff abusers, kind of thing, trying to destroy British industry, kind of thing. Whereas the Confederates were all kind of these plantation gentlemen, sort of thing, who were all quite in favor of free trade, especially in the cotton trade, for instance. So, but the British government, for various reasons I go into in the book, declares neutrality. And this throws a real wrench into Bullock's plan because he has to work within the boundaries of the law. And the law it's called the Foreign Enlistment Act. And this was a law that had been passed 50 years earlier, that had never been tested in court. Hardly anyone had ever heard of it. And nobody had read it, really. It was one of these bits of legislation that were passed originally to prevent British mercenaries volunteering for rebellious activity against the Spanish in South America. That's what it was for, and it was passed, and everyone just forgot about it. Nobody thought it would ever be used again. But it turns out that when you declare neutrality, that Foreign Enlistment Act swings into action. And what it means is that Bullock cannot build or commission or acquire, and I'm sort of simplifying here, warships for the Confederates. He can't do it. Anything that looks like a warship will be impounded. Anything like that. He can't recruit sailors in Britain to man these ships. Everything has to be civilian.
Yeah.
See, so he's really constrained, but he notices a loophole in this legislation that you could sail a fleet through that nobody had ever seen, or even, I mean, they hadn't conceived of it at the time. And that is that, yeah, you can't build or acquire or commission a warship, but there's nothing stating that you can't build, acquire, commission for instance, a civilian ship, like a freighter, or like just a sailing ship, as a civilian. And if it is armed and equipped as a warship in international waters, neutral waters, not within British jurisdiction, by Confederate officers and then commissioned into the Confederate Navy, there's no law against that. Queen Victoria does not rule, no matter what they say, it doesn't rule all the seas. Anything out of British jurisdiction is is open target. So with that in hand, Bullock can go around and see all these shipbuilders who are all very friendly. And as long as they don't ask him any questions about who this ship is for or what its ultimate intention is, then he's not going to tell them any lies. So, but they know, of course,
Sure.
what this all is. But essentially, so what he does is he just commissions a bunch of ships, blockade runners, and especially commerce raiders, like the later Alabama and that would become the Alabama, and the Florida, and the Shenandoah. And these were spick and span. They just look like regular civilian trading ship, merchant vessels. You see.
Yeah, so that was his goal, was to while he was there, was to get these ships to then be blockade runners against a blockade that the Union Army had set up on all the Confederate ports in America, right?
Yeah, that was the second complication. When when Bullock had left, there was no blockade, but Lincoln decides to impose a blockade on the entire South. Now, originally, people like Jefferson Davis and the Southern government thought this was a joke. And the reason for that is that there's about 3,500 miles of coastline. You are going to need thousands and thousands of ships to guard that coastline and prevent any ships going in or out. And by the way, you cannot just stop British or French ships from coming in. I mean, that's illegal under the terms of various diplomatic arrangements. That's the international law stated at the time that to be treated by outsiders like the British and the French as a real blockade, it had to be what's known as effective. And that is, it had to be seen to be working. It had to be blocking physically a lot of trade. You see, then then the British and the French have to respect it. But if there's a bunch of ships going in and out, in and out, in and out, like, yeah, out of Charleston and Galveston and all these places, then this is a blockade, as Jefferson Davis put it. It's a paper blockade. It's not real. And just because Lincoln says that it's a blockade doesn't mean that it is one. The British and the French will decide whether they respect it or not. So the point is to go back to what you were saying. The point is for Bullock to build or commission or hire or attract dozens and dozens and dozens of blockade runners. These were small fleet vessels that could smuggle in guns, munitions, luxuries,
Mm.
medications, drugs, even Bibles, things like that.
Well,
That
what
the
is
South
it?
lacked.
Was it so? Was cotton not? Was that not part of the? I got the impression that the real what Bullock wanted to do was to get past a blockade with cotton exports. But was that not the case?
That's what he wanted to do. Well, originally, again, everything changes while he's at sea, so it was a bit of a unpleasant shock when he when he uh, when he arrived in Liverpool and found that his very easy mission had suddenly become sort of mission impossible. The fact is that at the way the South had originally thought of paying for all of these ships that it wanted to build was to just send lots and lots of cotton. You have to remember the British economy. Something like 20% of the British population, directly or indirectly, relied on cotton for its daily bread. Now that includes mill owners. It includes hundreds of thousands of mill workers, sailors, brokers. Even the bakers, literally baking the daily bread for the people in the factories. I mean, it's a colossal dependence on Southern cotton in Britain at that time. The South knows this, of course, and that's where the famous phrase "King Cotton" comes from. I think it was some I can't remember his name. Hammond, I think. It declares, "You never declare war on King Cotton. We will destroy you." Because what we're going to do, and so what the South did was, I think, possibly the most foolish thing that it could have possibly have done, and that was to impose its own embargo on selling cotton to Britain or anywhere else, but especially Britain was the sort of recipient of about 97% of it, of Southern cotton. And at the same time as there was Lincoln's blockade. So you've got this dual blockade and self-embargo. Now, the reasoning behind the embargo was that it would it would threaten to induce a national heart attack in Britain, and that would in turn um, oblige the British to come onto the Confederate side. You see, and so they could get the cotton flowing again. Again, you can see there's a problem with here, and that is that you don't start messing with or threatening a hyperpower,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
Especially when you're the weaker party in this,
sure.
as the
Well, you
Confederacy.
you said this a little bit, but I'm very curious about the perceptions and the attitudes in England with the US Civil War. Now, you said that most people in England, if they had an opinion, well, you didn't say this, but you said that there were Confederate leanings in England for sure. You write in the book that Liverpool was like the most Confederate place in England, or
Yep.
I might be paraphrasing here. But talk a little bit about those attitudes. How did people in England view the U.S. Civil War?
The British attitude towards the Civil War was much more complex than we usually think. It was very confused, and to put it bluntly, they couldn't really get their heads around it. They didn't really. There was a lot of theories about what the war was actually about. There were some newspapers and journalists and politicians who thought that this was essentially just yet another just a regular turf war. We get them in Europe. It's just guys in the south, guys in the north. They each want to conquer each other. This is just an old tawdry tale of imperial power. There were others who thought the South were acting like spoiled little kids who hadn't gotten what they wanted, and when they didn't, they just stormed off and took their toys with them, and they've launched this dumb war. There were others who thought, well, the North had it coming. They're a bunch of bullies. We don't like them. Good for the South. And more to the point, there's always a bit of sympathy for the underdog, the rebels, all this kind of stuff. The teaching these, uptight Yankees a thing or two about fighting. There were also ones about there was a class thing. There were many aristocrats in Britain who quite liked the idea of this sort of rural utopia of the South with sort of lordly plantation owners governing over tens of thousands of acres. They kind of left out the slavery aspect of all of this, and but I think they kind of regarded it as kind of almost like the medieval peasant system. That was sort of how it translated into their heads. And there were still others who thought that thought that the South was just that they thought the South was right to rebel, but they couldn't support it. And the reason is, and people tend to forget this, is that Britain has an empire, and there are many colonies in, say, the Caribbean. And if they start supporting rebels against what is regarded as a legitimate government in Washington, then surely all of their imperial possessions could also have that same idea. And so you would have rebellions in many of the in many of the Caribbean countries. And let us not forget that this was about 1861. I think just a few years earlier, you'd had the what's traditionally known as the Great Mutiny, or in nowadays called the Rebellion in India against the East India Company, which had obliged the British government to come in and run India. They do not want to start giving lots of people all these terrible ideas about rebelling against central authority from
And
London.
and why Liverpool? Why was
Well,
Liverpool such a
so
hotbed?
basically, what the British government ended up doing was satisfying no one, and that is that's when they declared neutrality. You see, with benefits. So it wasn't so the South had, I think, a right to come into British ports, but they weren't recognized as an actual independent country. They were regarded as belligerents, which is a different diplomatic status. It was a very complicated little pirouette that the British were doing about how exactly to work out. But I think the Foreign Secretary, Lord Ross, at the time said, he just said, I don't know. I honestly don't know what our colonial cousins are up to. He said another one of their weird fights. I don't know what to do, but for God's sake, let's just keep out of it. So that was it. So basically, the British idea was neutrality. When we see who's emerging as a winner, then we'll back that side. The usual
Sure.
diplomatic stuff. As for Liverpool, Liverpool was even in Britain, where the Confederate sentiment was very high, owing to the usual romanticism. It was, as I said, it was because of the cotton links. There was a lot of links that went back generations. A lot of the great cotton lords were descended from the sort of the merchant princes of the 18th century who'd made fortunes in ships and dealing in slaves, African slaves for the South. And when Britain banned slavery or outlawed slavery, they kind of just switched from being slaving to cotton. Same, and they dealt with the same people essentially. So these links go back a long way, and this was a mercantile city that didn't want to have anything to do with politics, and they just thought the South was in the right here, that they could do deals with the South. The North was just a bunch of tariff blockers, and are just generally annoying people. And so Bullock remarks when he gets off the ship in Liverpool for the first time, and this was much to Dudley's disgust. He actually saw more Confederate bunting, flags and little bits and pieces from from stores and hung along streets and lampposts than you saw it even in Richmond. I mean, this was a super pro Confederate city. So when Bullock gets there, yes, he has some problems to deal with the Neutrality Act and everything, but he's on really friendly territory.
Sure.
I mean, he's the den of lions, and
Sure. Yeah.
to Dudley's Daniel.
Well, let's talk about some of the espionage activities that with Dudley and with Bullock. So this kind of cat and mouse game. What were some of these activities that they were more secretive activities, and what were they trying to thwart each other from doing?
Yeah, the actual setup was quite simple, and that was Bullock was there to build blockade runners, commerce raiders, and rams, ironclad rams. That was his mission, and he was dedicated to it. And Dudley's job was to stop him. That was essentially what he was supposed to do by any means necessary. Now, the problem is that Bullock has a thumb on the scale for him. The British government really doesn't want to act on things. It sort of turns the old sort of Nelsonic eye to a lot of things and just says, I don't see any problem here. If this, can we just make this problem go away? So Dudley is trying to stop Bullock through legal means. He's trying to get the British government interested in cracking down and enforcing the Foreign Enlistment Act, essentially, on Bullock. That will shut him down. Bullock, of course, is way too clever and feline for that. So he set things up that he's Mr. Clean Hands. He has no connection to a lot of the ships. He's got a bunch of front companies. There's hundreds of companies around that will do dealings with him, and they won't ask any questions about where things are. He's got things set up so that he's got a clean ship, in Liverpool, a merchant ship, and he's got a secret arms ship down in London, like in some old freighter that nobody's paid any attention to. And the two of them will rendezvous somewhere in the Azores or the international waters, and they will transfer the weapons to the ship and then and outfit the ship as a Confederate warship. So he's got this whole thing set up. And it's very, very difficult for Dudley in such an unfriendly environment to try and penetrate that network, to get in there and to get information, you see. So, but he just keeps on going. He loses several times. I mean, over and over again. It's like Bullock can see around walls, will see through walls and see around corners. He's like a magician. He seems like he always seems to know what Dudley's about to do, and take evasive action. In the book, again, it's not a big spoiler, but it turns out that that Bullock has an inside man at the Foreign Office who is supplying him with tip-offs that there's a raid coming, or Dudley's is planning something. Get that ship out now before the inspectors come. He's also, and I found this in the Bullock papers. Bullock was very careful about to destroy most of his papers, but for some reason he kept this, and it's an extraordinary document. It's about 13 or 14 pages long, handwritten document, and it is written by a clerk to Mr. Squarey, a great name for a very great Victorian name for Dudley's very trusted solicitor. You know, the guy who handles his legal affairs with the government. And it turns out that Bullock had obviously paid this clerk to tell him what was going on, like what Dudley was doing, what papers and affidavits he was filing through Mr. Squarey. And it's very detailed, and it's an extraordinary document because that's how Bullock knew everything that was going on. He had the inside track on everything. So it's an extraordinary sort of cat and mouse. It's not even cat and mouse. It's sort of cat versus cat uh, kind of situation, especially as Dudley, when he first arrives in Liverpool, he's this kind of quivering Dante figure. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't know the lingo. He doesn't understand how this city works. He's this naif there. And again, Bullock is just outplays him at every turn. But he learns, and he befriends this detective called Maguire, who's this kind of Irish red-haired, almost like a straight out of Central Casting. Yeah, and he's the guy who's been in Liverpool. He's a former cop when he become private detective. And he kind of shows this Dante. He's the Virgil who shows him around the Inferno and how to understand and how to change. So what happens is that over time Dudley becomes more like Bullock. You see, and he, instead of being the little quivering mouse, he becomes the dexterous cat. And so he turns the tables on Bullock, and he sort of outwits him. You see, that's
Yeah.
sort of the setup of the whole thing.
Well, and it's no, everybody knows the Union won the war, so not too
Doesn't
much
it?
of a
Spoiler alert, come on.
We'll talk a little bit about how things changed for both of these men as the Civil War progressed. At the beginning of the war, obviously, the South was doing much better, and Dudley was having a much harder time with what he was trying to do. But they mirror each other a bit. Talk a bit about how things changed for Dudley and for Bullock.
Yep, situations change. At the beginning of the war, Bullock is, he's cock of the walk. He's, he's got the run of Liverpool. He knows everything's going on. Bullock, but over time, the war in America changes, and attitudes that were in Britain in say 1860, 1861, they shift as well. And what over the course of the war, Bullock finds that over time he's the territory isn't as friendly as it once was. Let's put it that way. In fact, it's becoming distinctly unfriendly. And the great catalyst here was Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. You see, which when he originally announced that he was going to emancipate slaves, people in Britain were like, "Oh, this is just a little gimmick. He's not really going to do it. That's insane, right? He's not going to do it." But then he actually does it, and at that point, as Dudley writes home, he's astounded that there's this sort of winds of change sort of blow through Britain, and this becomes a moral crusade against slavery.
Yeah, I think you're right that at the very beginning of the war, there were like 3 anti-slavery meetings going on in Liverpool, but it jumps up to, like,
Even in the country,
in the
there was
country.
literally a handful of abolitionist meetings, and they always took place in these sort of drafty Quaker meeting houses in sort of Leicester or somewhere like that, and they were attended by 12 people. All of who were sort of well-meaning dissenters and all that kind of thing. Nobody cared. It was just sort of this weird niche interest. But after that, as Dudley says, he can't get over the fact that in early '63, even in Liverpool at St George's Hall or one of the great meeting halls, there's thousands of people who come to this abolitionist meeting and listen to for hours and hours. And at the end of it, the name of Lincoln is cheered,
Yeah,
which
and they're
was
there for human
unheard
rights.
of.
It's a human rights draw that brings them there. It's not some economic or other factor. It is slavery and how morally opposed these people are to slavery.
Yeah, I mean, there's a distinct difference, and I think I have a statistic in the book. I think I'm just for a comparison. There's like 8 or 9 abolitionist meetings in 1862, very small things. In 1863, there's something like 73 giant meetings that take place in all the major cities and that are packed out. And the name of Lincoln is cheered. This becomes a huge, wind at Dudley's back. And Bullock, for the first time, realizes he's on his back foot. That that things are going to start getting more tricky because when you have so many people suddenly backing the Union against the Confederacy, the British government is going to start taking a very close look at his doings. See, Dudley is just going to be given, a fairer hearing down in London, with it at the Foreign Office and the customs inspections and all this kind of stuff. It just becomes easier, and so that's when the tide begins to turn against Bullock, and it's not made better by the fact that the Confederacy too is on its back foot. So he's running out of money. As I said, with the embargo, this cotton embargo, the South shot itself in the foot in the sense that he didn't have any money. He had to go through all this weird cotton smuggling, you know, exploits in order to try and raise. And he's always trying to search around for money to build. You see, and as the war goes on, it becomes harder and harder to get credit. You know, his friends aren't quite as friendly as they once were. The British are cracking down. The U.S. Navy is also getting really pretty good at stopping blockade runners. So this is becoming an expensive sport to play because for a time it was like speculating in internet stocks in 2000 or whatever it was. You could you could like meme stocks or something. People would get together and they would fund a blockade runner and send in pianos and chandeliers and things to the South, and they would make a fortune on it. But once the U.S. Navy starts stopping your ship, you lose everything. Your ship gets taken off the board, and an experienced crew and captain get put in jail, and suddenly this isn't as much fun as it used to be. So that's essentially the situation from sort of 64 onwards. Things are getting very rough for Bullock, but he doesn't give up. He actually mounts his most ambitious escapade, and that was the Ironclad rounds. It's his last chance at greatness, and Dudley, manages to kibosh that through a very sort of convoluted means involving a very dubious French financier and a very odd transaction with a fake Egyptian pasha. It's a very,
Yeah,
very odd story, very complicated story about how it went down.
towards the end, there are a lot of foreign actors that enter the picture. I didn't realize that Napoleon III was pro-Confederate
Oh,
in
he
France.
was. He at one point Bullock actually thinks of moving operations because things are becoming so unfriendly in Britain. He thinks of moving operations to Paris, and he actually approaches Napoleon III and says, "Hey, do you think you could give the Confederacy some ships?" Napoleon III can see the writing on the wall too. Here, you can also see who's losing. He doesn't want to be on the losing side, and so he says, that sort of Gallic shrug type thing. And it's through those meetings that Bullock meets this French financier called Monsieur Brevet, who has connections in the Middle East and Egypt, and that's when he comes up with this ambitious plan to build these two warships. Which again, you seriously breaking the Foreign Enlistment Act with that. You can't hide these as civilian ships when they've got metal moving turrets on board. I mean, they're made of
Sure.
iron, and they're going to be built on behalf of the nascent Egyptian Navy, and the French financier is going to be the broker, and then it's going to transfer the ownership at sea. It's one of these very strange, gun running, arms operations. Very, very complicated, but it's quite good fun. So that I had a lot of. I was very interested in sort of excavating that completely forgotten story and putting it together. Very complex about how it all went down.
Well, ultimately, Dudley prevails over Bullock. The Union wins the Civil War. What? So how did Dudley's efforts? How did that help the Union win the war?
Dudley's efforts were important because people tend to forget this. They tend to think about the Civil War as guys in blue and gray fighting at Gettysburg. They think of the land war. and what was happening in America. I mean, which was obviously important, but they tend to not really think too much about the war on the waters, the naval aspects of this whole thing. And what Dudley, the reason why Dudley's important is because he stops Bullock from sending all of these blockade runners and commerce raiders and ironclad rams from either getting out or inflicting too much damage. The war was not a foregone conclusion in 1861 to 1863 by any means. And also, you have to remember the South doesn't have to win the war. What it does is it just has to not lose. You see, so that's really the basis for Bullock's strategy here. In that he doesn't have to sink the entire U.S. Navy. He just has to cause enough havoc and chaos and sink enough of them that Lincoln, or hopefully his successor, McClellan. That's what the South was backing in the, I think, the 1864 election. They were trying to mount an operation to move public opinion against Lincoln, is that they need to, the South can kind of extract or offer an armistice. See, it's not a peace, it's not a surrender, but it's an armistice, and the lines will say. So that's the big game here. You see, that's out of everything. But by crippling Bullock so many times, despite so many challenges, you know, Dudley kind of removes that option, you see, from the table. And so, yes, the war has to be fought to its conclusion. And yes, the South has to surrender unconditionally rather than getting away with it with an armistice that will probably preserve slavery for another few generations until it can be sort of slowly eradicated. So that's how important Dudley was.
Well, I know one of your previous books has already been turned into a TV series. What's the is there a future? Would you like to see this adapted to TV or film? It has a
Yes,
very
'cause
cinematic
I
feel to
very
it.
much enjoy earning a lot of money. Uh, I would love to see that. I would love to see all my books turned into
Wonderful.
the latest Spielberg flick. But
Are there any talks? Is that in is that a discussion that you're having right
we're
now?
talking to a couple of people. But once you've done this a few times, you realize, and this was the same with Washington Spies. A lot of books get optioned. There's a lot of talk. People love to talk. People love to have lunches. Um, but at the end of the day, I don't know, 1 out of 500 ever makes it to screen. So never get too excited about it. This is kind of interesting. But there's a couple of talks. We'll see. I think it would be fantastic if I do say so myself.
Now,
Uh,
I think I might have read this wrong, but I was looking at your bibliography on Wikipedia or something, and it will show like
well, yeah,
appearances
don't
or
believe.
whatever.
Don't believe. But
Did
okay,
you
yeah,
did you make an appearance on the Washington Spies TV show on
yes.
film?
It's my great Oscar-worthy acting. It is
Wonderful.
in the. I think it was in the final season, and I was writing on the show, you see, and helping produce it, and I just thought, oh, it'd be so cool to just be in the show, just as a cameo, because the one thing you learn is that when you do these kind of cameos, there's one or two other cameos from some of the other writers in there, just over the course of the episodes, and I thought I want to be immortalized in film, and but you can't have a speaking role because that takes a job away from actually, like a real actor who earns money for it rather than just me showboating. And so I came up with, I think I was a lieutenant or an ensign or something like that to Bern Gorman, who is Major. Oh, what's his name? What's his name?
Hewlett?
Hewlett. That's it.
Yeah.
Yes, one of my favorite characters to write, and I was his aide. And so my job, and you see me in one of the episodes, for no particular reason, Major Hewlett is walking down darkened streets, and I'm behind him carrying a briefcase. And,
Very nice.
and at one point, I think I sort of salute him and take the case and walk down the street. So
Wow.
that was my great acting, appearance.
Well, now if this goes to film or TV, who are you going to play?
I would probably
Be a
be
pickpocket in Liverpool?
unshaven sailor number 4. in the background, just sort of drinking from a bottle of rum or something. That'll be what I do.
Wonderful.
But yeah, no, it was a lot of fun.
I'm sure.
acting's not as easy as you think. I mean, I did get plaudits from all the professional actors there, of course, for my
Sure.
brilliant turn. But it's a hard gig, I have to say.
Well, Alex, this has been a terrific interview and discussion, and I've learned so much from you and from your book. So thank you so much for coming on. If folks want to, if they want to follow you, or if they want to get in touch, how can are you on social media? How can people get in touch with you?
I have a website, um, alexrose.com. That's where you can contact me through there. There's a contact page there, and you can find out more about my books and things like that. I also run a Substack newsletter on historical intelligence, historical spying, stuff that interests me. That's called Spionage. That's Spionage. That's on Substack. Comes out once or twice a month. It's a free thing. Sign up for it. Glad to have you on board. And I'm on Twitter and under I think Alex Rose Writer. I don't spend a whole lot of time on there, but I'm around. So yeah,
Wonderful.
feel free to stop by.
Wonderful. Well, Alexander Rose, The Lion and the Fox, two rival spies, and the secret plot to build a Confederate Navy. Go pick up a copy. Go check it out from your library. Read the story. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And Alex, thanks so much for coming on today.
Well, thanks for having me on. Thanks for listening to my very long
Absolutely.
explanation.
No, no, my pleasure. My pleasure.